Today we are joined by Katherine Spearing and Cait West for their session, Stay-at-Home Daughters, the Unique Challenges of Women Raised in the Christian Patriarchy Movement. Katherine Spearing is the founder of Tears of Eden, a nonprofit supporting survivors of spiritual abuse, and the host of Tears' affiliate podcast, Uncertain. She also hosts the podcast Trauma and Pop Culture and is a certified trauma recovery coach working primarily with clients who have survived cults, high control environments, spiritual abuse, and sexual abuse. She also provides specialized trauma-informed career coaching, as folks with trauma often need extra support for interviewing and networking. Katherine is the author of a historical romantic comedy, Hartfords, a novel that challenges gender roles in a patriarchal society that will appeal to fans of Jane Austen. She has been a guest on a number of podcasts, including Indoctrination and That's So Fucked Up, the author of several nonfiction articles, and writes regularly at katherinespearing.com and tearsofeden.org. Cait West is a writer and editor based in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Her work has been published in The Revealer, Religion Dispatches, Fourth Genre, and Hawaii Pacific Review, among others. As an advocate and survivor of the Christian patriarchy movement, she serves on the editorial board for Tears of Eden, a nonprofit providing resources for survivors of spiritual abuse, and co-hosts the podcast Survivors Discuss. Her book, Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy, has released in April of 2024. Thank you for joining us, and welcome, Katherine and Cait.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cait West. I am a writer and an editor living in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And as an advocate and a survivor of the Christian patriarchy movement, I volunteer with the nonprofit Tears of Eden to serve survivors of spiritual abuse. And I also co-host the podcast Survivors Discuss. I've written about my experience growing up in the book Rift, a memoir of breaking away from Christian patriarchy. And I'm here today with my colleague, Katherine Spearing, to talk about Christian patriarchy and the stay-at-home daughter movement. Culture wars and backlash against the feminist movement in the 1990s led to the rise of an ideology called Christian patriarchy or biblical patriarchy in the United States. Organizations such as Vision Forum and grassroots magazines and newsletters, such as Patriarch Magazine, spread this ideology, gaining followers across evangelical denominations, many of whom continue to follow this lifestyle today. This movement established men as the leaders of the church and fathers as cult leaders of their families. Those raised as female in this movement were kept isolated and homeschooled and were often forbidden higher education, dating, and working outside the home, hence their name, stay-at-home daughters. Instead, they were trained to propagate the ideology by becoming homemakers, told to marry and bear as many children as possible. And I'd like to start by reading an excerpt from my memoir. I have long attempted to find the words to accurately describe what happened to me, and the short version is always too short. I was born into a strict religious family, homeschooled, and ruled by authoritarian discipline and a literal interpretation of the Bible. We eventually stumbled into the Christian patriarchy movement, but I was told it was God's plan all along. Chance or luck was non-existent in our world. Now that I've left the movement, I see how my father led us deeper into an environment where he could control every aspect of our lives, my life, where he would be rewarded and praised for his narrow views and inflexible rules. I am calling this a movement because Christian patriarchy is an ideology that cuts across many Protestant denominations. Some might call it a cult, a high control group ruled by hierarchy and oppression. In the case of Christian or biblical patriarchy, the cult leader is each family's father, deemed prophet, priest, and king of the household, a Christ figure. The mother's purpose is to support her husband in raising the children and taking care of the home. And the children are considered arrows in the quiver of their parents, weapons to wage a spiritual war on the secular culture. Satan, and all manner of evil and the ultimate fight for good. Because of this metaphor taken from the Psalms, some call this belief system quiverful. I became a stay-at-home daughter because I had no other choice. I lived at home under submission to my father long after I turned 18, waiting for my future husband, waiting for my future. I tried to follow all the rules, obey my father in all things, and put to death my sinful self as I sacrificed for the greater purpose. And for many years, I succeeded. And then I did the impossible. I left. I did not leave in a day, but over a long time of gathering strength and resources. In some sense, I am still leaving, even though it's more than a decade since I boarded a plane to start my life over. I like to think that the farther I get away from the damage, the closer I get to myself. That even though my life rifted apart, my body, mind, and spirit can finally heal, that I can be free. But always I am reminded that deep down, I am made of the materials gathered from my past. The best I can do is return to the trauma, acknowledge the truth, and make space for who I am becoming. This is a story of loss and separation. This is a story of chaos, of fragmentation, hidden beneath the facade of a happy family. This is a story of escape and risk and making it all worth it. This is a story of psychological, emotional, financial, and spiritual abuse. This is my story of survival. We were called stay-at-home daughters. We had scrapbooking birthday parties. We sent each other handwritten letters, trading stickers when we were young, copying poetry as we grew older. The highlight of our year was the Civil War ball put on by the homeschooling community. We spent months sewing lace and satin gowns. We wanted to feel beautiful, feminine, like Meg in Little Women. We learned classical piano and memorized traditional hymns, songs with steady beats and predictable endings. We huddled together after Sunday service and shared prayer requests. We never talked about boys in particular, but we imagined future husbands, our lives fulfilled as wives and mothers. We were 16 and 17 and 18 and 21 and 29. Age didn't matter as much as whether we were unmarried or married. The girls who were picked by husbands became women and moved away, or became too busy to talk anymore. They became pregnant on their honeymoons. They never went to college. They didn't share the secrets of the marriage bed with the rest of us, or tell us whether they were happy or whether they regretted it. We thought marriage must be like dying and going to heaven. God was the author of my story. He had a plan for my life, and my father had control over the details. The language of this story was simple. Girls like me weren't fragile, but complacent. Not stupid, but submissive. Not objects, but weaker vessels. One day I would marry a man approved by my father, and this would be God's reward. I always knew this story had power, but the power was never mine. We were stay-at-home daughters, but we didn't stay at home forever. Some of us escaped. We became voices on the internet, peeling back the skins of our sheltered lives and scooping out the beating hearts of our stories. We support each other with the telling of our lives, exposing the dark, making known what had always been kept hidden, hushed in the night. We are beginning again. Some of us are married, some divorced. We share memories of a time when life seemed simpler. We share the knowledge that nothing was as it seemed. It was like living in a dream, being sedated by the weaving of words, half-truths, total lies. Some of us have woken up from the dreams, the hallucinations, only to suffer paralysis or night terrors. We do not always know the names of our emotions. We don't know how to wake the others up. So that was an excerpt from my memoir, and now I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Katherine Spearing.
Yeah, before I jump in, I will just reflect. It's helpful to just kind of take a moment and just like remembering it and remembering what it was like, and just how all encompassing it was for life. So thank you for reading that. And I will share a little bit about myself and then also read an excerpt as well. So my name is Katherine Spearing. I am the founder of Tears of Eden, a nonprofit supporting survivors of spiritual abuse, and the host of Tears affiliate podcast, Uncertain. I also host a podcast called Trauma and Pop Culture, and I am a certified trauma recovery practitioner. I work primarily with clients who have survived cults, high control environments, spiritual abuse, sexual abuse. Additionally, I provide specialized trauma-informed career coaching, as folks with trauma often need extra support for interviewing and networking. That's also really important to me with my story and working with women who were not given the resources to provide for themselves and have careers. So that's really important to me and my work as well. I am the author of a historical romantic comedy called Hartfords, a novel that challenges gender roles in a patriarchal society and will appeal to fans of Jane Austen. I have been a guest on a number of podcasts and the author of several nonfiction articles, and I write regularly at katherinespearing.com and also tearsofeden.org. I am going to read an excerpt. Cait's was more of a macro overview of the movement itself, and then mine is going to be more of a micro view of just kind of like a day in the life of this movement. All right. Southern weather was unpredictable and rarely pleasant. You spent most summer days dashing from the indoor AC to the pool. The first few minutes in a sun-soaked car were the very definition of misery, and I imagined what every day in hell might feel like. On one of those rare, pleasant days, my father held church outdoors. The lawn of the field was freshly mowed, and we sat in camp chairs circled about him as he prepared to impart valuable wisdom. We didn't mind Sundays so much. I didn't mind Sundays so much. After getting through my father's 2 to 3 hour sermons, most of which I was able to tune out with a storyline I made up in my head, I usually had the rest of the day to myself. I could read, nap, write. We weren't supposed to work on Sundays, so there was no danger of my father asking us to do construction work on the house. But that Sunday, that particular Sunday, it would change my life forever. The Smiths were a pillar family in the patriarchal movement. This wasn't a name the movement claimed for itself. It was a term unaffectionately applied by those who left. Those who followed this teaching simply believed they were doing things God's way, following an orthodox path. In this movement, fathers were the heads of the home. Mothers were the helpmeets. Children were a gift from the Lord. The more children a family had, the more blessed they were by God. I heard many a sermon shaming those who chose to only have 2 or 3 children. Most in the movement believed the way the Christians would take over the world was by having children and training them in the way of the Lord. Then those children would have children, and the apostates and the lukewarm would die out because families of 2 or 3 children had nothing on a family of 7. These teachings were powerful. They were motivating. I wanted to be a part of this movement to take over the world, and I was happy to play my part. But we weren't a part of this movement yet, not until that Sunday. My parents had spent the previous evening at the home of my best friend Emily and her family. The Smiths were good friends with Emily's family, held in high regard in the homeschool community. They had homeschooled when it was dangerous, and now they had 4 godly adult children. None of the adult children were married at the time, and that was a little strange considering how important marriage was in the movement. But it was a small matter. We could all easily believe the Lord was saving them for someone special, or there just wasn't anyone good enough for them. The day following this meeting, my father held court. The sermon was short, and more a moment for my father to announce our family was taking a new direction. Since women were meant to be wives and mothers, helpmeets to a husband and caretakers of children, there was no need for them to go to college. In fact, it was a waste of time. All the daughters of our family would stay home and serve their father until they married, the same way the only Smith daughter served her father. At the time, she was in her mid-30s. My father was so very proud of this new plan. He announced it as if it were the answer he'd been searching for all along. It probably was. and my heart sank so deep in my stomach, I thought I might throw up. I had not realized until then, but I was biding my time, biding it until I graduated high school at 18 and disappeared to college. I hadn't realized how much I was looking forward to the freedom of adulthood until that freedom was whipped away from my hands following one conversation. Right then and there, I started to cry. I said desperately, "How will I ever meet a husband if I don't go to college?" My father's face changed from one of glee to one of anger. He said, "How dare I cry because I didn't know how I'd find a husband without college? Was God not big enough to provide as long as we were pleasing him?" He also said it was my fault I had ever planned to go to college in the first place. He, my father, had never told me I would go to college. I made it up in my mind that college was in the plan. I distinctly remember in that moment, flashing back to my 16th birthday a few months earlier, my mother had helped me pick out a camera, the kind with film, and had said that she wanted me to have a good camera, one I could take with me to college. Everyone went to college. It was part of the circle of life. My greatest sin in the following years was the sin of filling in the blanks, assuming something my father had never said. If my father didn't tell me what to think about something, I'd decide what I thought on my own. Then my father would shame or punish me for making a decision for myself without speaking to him, for thinking without his direct guidance. We danced this dance for 10 years. But in that moment, I didn't blame my father. All I could do was shove my desire down deep and watch as so many expectations turned to ash that floated away at a gust of wind. I imagined once or twice inventing a device that allowed me to go back in time so I could puncture the tire of my parents' car so they wouldn't go meet with the Smiths. But I couldn't blame the Smiths either. This movement itself was a subset of the homeschool movement. My parents were bound to encounter the teaching, and my father had been waiting for just the right thing that would allow him to take absolute control of his family. He'd finally found it.
Thank you for sharing that. I feel like we had a similar conversation in my family when we officially became part of this movement and we were like officially no more dating.
Yes. The
Yeah.
end. Your life is no longer yours.
Yeah. And to be told to have a different idea and then to be told like, no, it's going to change and you're not going to have any choices, really. It's devastating.
Yeah. And just how just the whiplash of like there wasn't a whole lot of direction and then suddenly like total control and just the confusion and just like it just like exemplifies how just like you're just kind of at the whim of whoever the head man is in the family, and it's like you don't really get any, you just have to like pivot, do whatever they want, and if they're a good person it might not be so bad, and if they're not so good it can be absolute total misery, and you just have no control, no power, or very, very little over just anything at all.
Right.
It's
And that speaks to how the father is like that mini cult leader of each family. You know, he's the prophet, priest, and king of the family and is total control. And so it's like this mini cult is your family inside of this bigger cult of the movement. So
yeah.
yeah. So I guess our first question is, what's it like for a
What's it like?
daughter? What's it like for a daughter inside
What's
this
it
cult?
like? Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just think even just like the idea of my father like controlling my thoughts, like he got to control my
Yeah.
thoughts, and it was like I was responsible for like submitting my thoughts to him. And if I didn't do that, then I was wrong, and like all of the little things that you had to do to make sure that you were in line with everything that he wanted for you
Mhm.
was just so just identity eviscerating, and just like the miracle it kind of feels like of like having an identity now of like you being years out of it, and how it would just you're just not allowed to have thoughts and feelings and emotions, but it doesn't mean that you don't have those things. It's just they're just so hyper controlled.
Mm-hmm.
And just like always just like submitting. uh and it was submitting to God, but the father got to determine what God wanted. So it was very
Yeah.
confusing. It was really confusing. Confusion,
Yeah.
control, just stifling, but you don't know that you're being stifled because it's just so normal. What was it like for you?
Same, I think, being repressed and having to stuff down any opinions or thoughts that didn't conform. And you are losing a sense of yourself. You are part of this collective, and that's your identity, is becoming a wife and a mother one day. And um, I think I think for me, there was a sense of positive framing around, well, you will never have to work, or you'll never have to be scared because we'll always protect you. And so they framed it in this positive language. And then they gave us things to do, like learn how to manage a household and cook and clean, and like, very patriarchal
Mentioned the
behaviors.
scrapbooking and I had like a cringe. I was like, I remember scrapbooking.
Yeah, scrapbooking, like all these things that keep us busy.
Keep your little
And
hands busy.
you're allowed to play piano, but you can't, be a concert pianist, and stuff like that. Like, you can develop as a person, but only within these really small confines, and that doesn't give you room to be curious or explore your identity. Your identity is just wrapped up in this whole ideology, and it's really dehumanizing.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I just like the little things that, yeah, the framing of it as benevolence,
Yeah.
just framing of it as benevolence, like, oh, you don't have to work and don't worry, you're not gonna have to ever work. Like, you don't ever have
Mhm.
to, don't worry your little head about, finances, and, you're never gonna have to worry about that. And it's just like whole, like framed that way. But the framing of it, I think, also made you afraid of those things. I don't know if that was the same for you, but like I was scared of like a career, and I was scared of education. Um,
Mhm.
and for reasons that were, I just remember being like, you might get assaulted by your boss if you have a male boss. Well, first
Yeah.
of all, it was just kind of assumed that my boss would be male. Uh, and then also just assumed that if you were outside of the home, you're gonna be assaulted. And just that framing of things of, one, we're taking care of you, so don't worry, but then also it's dangerous out there. Like, it's
And it's
dangerous.
always going to be your fault.
Yeah, absolutely. There was zero like,
Mhm.
oh, you shouldn't have been assaulted in the first place.
Mhm.
Or framing of like, well, if there were more women in the workplace, maybe this wouldn't happen. Nothing. That was just like women shouldn't be in the workplace. And just a lot of fear around just normal life stuff, just like very basic human interactions, fear
Mhm.
of non-Christians, fear of men, fear of, any kind of relationship with men. And there's just like this extremer version of what evangelicals call purity culture, which is, keeping yourself pure before marriage and all of the things that
Mm.
go into that. But it was even more extreme than that, in terms of just like your heart had to just kind of always be in control, and you couldn't let your heart be given away to like anyone. So you couldn't really even be like have friendships with men. They were always
No.
kind of held up as more superior to women. And it played out in like male female relationships that were not like married relationships, of in that community of the male superiority over women. And I just remember, situations where it's like even the boys that were like my age just kind of ruled things, and everything. And it was just kind of like this little like, pod, and the men were always determining. We were just kind of play acting all of these things as teenagers and young adults. And just, yeah, just super, super bizarre demographics and culture, and just so weird now.
Yeah.
Looking back on it, yet it was just so normal. It was
Right.
a reality.
And I'm a straight, cis het woman. So for me, this gender binary was oppressive in itself. But then for people who are non-binary or trans or gay, like it's even another dynamic of abuse on an identity, because you can't even exist as that person in this world.
Or having thoughts, which was my experience of like not even really being sure that I wanted to get married. And that wasn't an acceptable thought to have. Like it was
Right.
like, there's something, I always felt like there was something wrong with me, that I wasn't really sure that that was something that I wanted. And it was always felt like I was like forcing myself to like try to have that desire. Like, come on, kickstart it. Just like get excited. And it just wasn't there for me in the same way that it was for peers. And so just like all of the preparation for marriage was just it really felt like playing, like just like it felt like I was just like performing and like playing a role. And like this vision of like my future. And I think some of it was like I couldn't imagine that as future because it kind of terrified me a little bit. And I think I was just kind of, the thought of it just kind of felt oppressive and stifling a little bit. And just watching my parents' marriage and like looking at my mother and being like, is that it? Like, that's what my life is going to be? And it was always like painted as this like ideal. And this was like this, wonderful thing. And then I read Little Women and I'm like, I want to be Joe. Like, I don't, no Meg for me. I want to be Joe. Like, and just like this, like I didn't fit. And so just like this, I was always aware that I didn't fit. And it was just like, there's something wrong with me. I'm just wrong kind of woman, and just like get in line and figure it out, and, cut off those parts of you that aren't fitting and suppress them and keep them down. And all just constantly reining things in. And I think that I don't think it worked out well for women who were more of the ideal. I don't think it was easier necessarily, but it was just different. There were just different things to navigate, I think.
Yeah, because you're either under the headship, the authority of your father until you get married, and then that authority transfers to your husband. And so you're never on your own, or there's never an idea of a single woman. You're either a daughter or a wife.
I know I had those conversations with my father about it, because it was all about marriage, like marriage, prepare for marriage, learn how to cook. Okay. Learn how to clean. Got it. And like all of these things, there's like, what exactly are we preparing for? It's like you're preparing to be a homemaker, like that's what you're preparing for. And I remember having these conversations with my father of just like, well, what if I don't get married? And like, well, what if I'm 25? Oh, what if I'm 25 and I'm not married yet? Because that was just like this age. Everyone gets married so young. And it was like this like age that you're supposed to like, that would be, oh, if you're not married by 25, you're probably going to be a spinster. And my father was just like, there wasn't a category for him for that. Like he didn't have a category for that. And he was just like, kept saying like, we'll just cross that bridge when we come to it. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And it was just like, at what point have we come to the bridge? Like, at what point do we get to make alternate plans? Because this marriage thing is not happening. But I just don't think there was a category. There wasn't a category in this world for that to not happen. You were perpetually in the preparation state for this ideal womanhood of being married and being a mom.
And this promise of if you follow all these rules and if you do
Yes.
this, then I was told like you're going to get married. It's not going to be like God's going to bless you with a marriage. Like there's no question that you would be single, which is unrealistic. Like,
Did you know older women who were unmarried? Like, and what was the narrative about those women? Older women,
um,
like in their 30s. Like,
no, I mean, this happened. A woman moved in with my family in her 30s. I believe she was in her 30s at that point because her father had died. And so she needed a male head to like find her a husband. And so it was considered not too late for her, but my father sent he sent letters to every church in our area to ask if there were any young men that would be interested in pursuing a marriage with her. And so it was more direct, like we need to get her married. It wasn't like when I was 20 years old and we just like kind of wait and see. It was like she needs to get married because she just can't exist as a single person.
yeah, I think my family was super awfully judgmental. And we would look at, there were a lot of families, like especially you mentioned Vision Forum earlier, like we were really involved in Vision Forum for a while. And there were a lot of unmarried older women who were like late 20s, early 30s, some getting up to 40. There were some who were turning 40 and still living with their parents. And my parents were always trying to figure out what they were doing wrong so that we like wouldn't do the same thing. And I think that we stopped going actively to Vision Forum events because there were so many unmarried women, and it looked like the men were marrying outside of the Vision Forum community. Like they weren't, like these girls were not people that they wanted to marry. And so it was kind
Oh,
of like, oh, this isn't working, and so let's not do it this way, let's like do it this other like different extreme, and like what were these women doing wrong that they weren't getting married?
yeah,
Like, and it was just like there was no like category for like, oh well, they maybe that's just their life and that's just who they're going
right.
to be. And I know a lot of those women just stalk them periodically on the internet. Many of them still aren't married and
Hmm.
never got married. And so it was a category, but then it also wasn't a category. And it was
Yeah,
definitely not the ideal. And it was very confusing for sure.
yeah. So we're given this one option, like you can get married or you can just live with your father forever. Um, and
Yeah.
then the other option is like to escape, which nobody talked about, but both
That
you and
wasn't supposed to happen.
yeah, you and I both did that. And I feel like at the time for me, I felt like I was the only one who did that. But it turns out a lot of young adults did leave this group. And so, but not as many as I would hope, because it's so difficult. So
Yeah.
let's talk about like why is it so difficult to escape from this particular group?
Yeah. Yeah, and even just like, I mean, most of it's so practical, and it's like a domestically violent situation, domestic violence of like a domestic violent marriage, of how much control they had. And I gratefully had a bank account, and I remember going to the bank and like removing my parents from my bank account when I was starting my escape plan because I didn't want them to, I was genuinely afraid that if they figured it out, that they would take my money out of my account, my like whatever $400 that I had in there. Um, and just like that type of thing. And then you're not allowed to get educated, you're not allowed to have a career, so you can't get money, like you can't get
Yeah.
resources to leave. You can't own a car. Maybe you do have a car, but then your father also owns the car and it's in his name, and so if you took it then you would be stealing, like just all of these very practical coercions and control things that prevent you from having the resources to leave.
Mhm.
And it's not seen that way. It's not seen as financial abuse, it's seen as protection. You don't have to worry about these things. And I think you and I both know people who didn't have birth certificates, didn't have secure social security numbers, didn't have driver's licenses, never learned how to drive. And it was just all considered unnecessary. Because why would you need those things? Like, why would you need those skills? And gratefully, I had a driver's license, but just think of how challenging it is, if your internet's being controlled, if you don't know where things are, you're isolated community wise, so there's nobody for you to talk to get help from. And the number of people that you can talk to is just so limited. And even just like things like this happened in my family, of a sister started talking to a guy, and my father found out because he saw her text message call records on the cell phone plan that he owned, and that was how he found out. And so, like, you're looking at that, like you are looking at the phone numbers that your children are calling. And so, like, even just calling someone to get help is just so many things are limited. What are other things that you have seen that make it difficult for people to leave?
Yeah, and I want to like emphasize that it's not always children, right? Because once we turn 18, we're not allowed to leave, right?
Right.
So we're
I
legal
reverted
adults.
a moment. Like,
I
seeing
mean,
myself as a child, but I wasn't. I was very
right.
much a full-grown woman.
I was taught that I wouldn't be an adult until I got married. And so I didn't understand that I had legal rights.
Mm.
And because I was homeschooled and because in the US there's aren't very good homeschool regulations, nobody told me different. And I didn't have any access to understand that
But
I
you
did
didn't
have rights.
even know that you were not a minority.
Yeah.
Whoa. Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't understand that I could just leave.
Not a minority, minor. You didn't know you
Yeah,
were.
minor.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah, so I think that's why I like always advocate for homeschooling regulations, just so like children understand like they have choices when they turn 18 and also when they're younger. Abuse is never okay.
Ever.
But I think when you like back to why it's difficult, like you grow up in this environment where this is normalized, and
Mhm.
so you don't understand what a different life would even look like. So it's hard to imagine what that would be because your access to information is so limited. Um, and also, I was thinking about, for me, I was told how to respond to people who asked me questions about my life with
Mhm.
this very scripted answer. Like I was taught, this is what you say when people ask about this. And I would say, "Oh, I don't need to go to college because I'm going to be a wife and a mother someday and I don't need that." And so I would just follow the rules and say this script. And so that would shut down anybody actually asking me questions.
Yeah.
And eventually those questions did stick with me, and helped me like start to think about leaving. But they didn't understand how serious of a problem it was because I couldn't tell the truth all the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're not lying because you
No.
believe it,
Hmm.
or you at least want to believe it. And you think if you say it enough times, it will be true. And I know that I was chronically depressed and high functioning depressed the whole time that I lived in my father's house, but I had no idea. And if someone were to ask me if I was happy, I would have said yes. Like, it
Right.
just, like, I didn't have a reference for anything else or any other alternative. And where I lived was in the South. And so there was like the more extreme Christian patriarchy, stay at home daughter stuff happening. But then the next layer was just, average evangelicalism, which wasn't a lot different. Like, just women went to college, maybe, but it was still expected that they would get married at 22, 23 years old.
Hmm.
And then as soon as they started having kids, it was expected that they would stay home with their kids. That was just in the water, in the soup. And so there was no alternative lifestyle outside of marriage and children for women, other than just a handful of outliers that nobody knew what to do with. And they were all just considered really weird and bizarre and doing something wrong. And so it was just so, you're just in an
The
inch.
culture.
It's, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that a lot of cultures and a lot of family cultures, children stay home or late when they turn adults. A lot of times they stay home when they go to college or as they figure out how to take their next steps into adulthood. But the difference is we weren't given a choice. And so we were coerced to stay home. And we didn't even see how it was coercion because it was this promise of good blessings if we did it. So I think you're told this lie and you want to believe it because you want to believe your parents want the best for you. And so the hardest part to leave is thinking is your mindset, of flipping that mindset from I just have to do this, this, and this, and God will bless me to maybe my father doesn't want the best for me, or maybe this is
Mhm.
abuse and not love.
Yeah. And then the added layer, and this is common in a lot of cults, of this is what God wants. And you are doing this because you're following the Lord.
Right.
And if you don't do this, then you're mispleasing the Lord. And look at the Old Testament and what God did to people when they didn't follow him. He wiped them out. He sent snakes. He sent plagues. He sent, wars. He sent all of these things to punish them when they didn't follow God. So you're believing not just that this is your father, like this is what
Mhm.
God wants you to do. And if you're not doing, you're not pleasing God. And if you don't please God, then bad things will happen to you. And a lot of folks who leave cults experience the phobias. And a lot of folks who leave this environment describe it as like fear of God striking them down by lightning. And that's how I described it too, of just terror, just absolute terror that something horrible was going to happen.
Mhm.
Um, if I rebelled. And when I did rebel and like got to freedom, just the aftermath of just fear of, and then every bad thing that happened that were just life, like a car accident or, you know, just, very normal, burning your food, like anything that is just part of life, the hazard of being human and just living in the world. It was always just like, oh my God, like what is God punishing me for? Like, is this God's punishment? Is this God, and just like that
Yeah.
is so ingrained into your psyche. And it's not just like, oh, let's just flip a switch and everything is, and just don't believe that anymore. It's not that easy.
Mhm.
It's deeply ingrained trauma into our nervous system, and it's not easy to get over in order to leave. And then once you're out, we're not, it also doesn't just completely disappear, and you're not just, oh fine, everything's fine once you're yeah, which I guess this leads into like just the unique experiences of people after they leave.
Mhm.
What are some things that you experienced after leaving and have seen from other women after they leave?
Yeah. And I think anyone leaving a group like this, a cult, is going to have a hard time transitioning into living without it, because it's like it's your whole world. For me, I struggled with PTSD right away because I was going through a lot of abuse before I left. I left when I was 25 and I was just so tight, so tight. My body was so tight. And then when I left, I was like so excited. I was free. I was like, I get to make choices. I get to explore the world. I was so excited, but then it just felt like my body was relaxed. And so like all this trauma came into like existence. I mean, it was already there, but it was just I could feel it. I could feel it finally because I wasn't dissociating as much. And so I really struggled with anxiety, nightmares, things that a lot of people with PTSD struggle with. But I didn't have the language for that because in this group, at least in my family, psychologists were like demonic, right? So we never would go to a mental health professional to get help for anything anxiety related. And so I didn't have the language to describe what I was experiencing. So I was just very confused. I was like, I left this terrible situation. I'm in a much safer place, and now I feel awful.
Yeah.
Um, and now I know that's because I was in a safe enough place to feel those feelings. And I had to process all of it. But I didn't know that at the time. So it was really scary. And I didn't have financial resources to get help. So I just kind of suffered with that for years, not understanding what it was or how to get help for it. So, and I think a lot of people coming out of this world might have similar things because anytime they've expressed issues with mental health, it's always you're sinning or it's your fault.
God, yeah.
You just need to pray more. Or they would send you to Christian counselors who would give you very bad advice. So I think that is really a unique challenge for people like us because we just don't understand um, the resources that are available.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you brought up just the idea that the trauma just kind of rose to the surface after you got out. And that just idea of like when you're in survival mode, like your body is just doing the things that it needs to do to survive, which is what it's supposed to do. You're not in a safe space. You
Yeah.
are getting up, you were eating your food, you were doing the day to day. And so once you do get to safety, and all of that stuff starts to come up, it can feel like, oh, we're regressing, we're reverting, it's all going bad because I left. And the reality is your body now feels safe. And so that trauma that was always there and always being stored up is now like, oh, we can come out now and we can start expressing these feelings of depression and anxiety and fear that was always there, but we just couldn't look at it because we couldn't address it because we were just surviving. So that's very common too. But if you don't have the resources and you don't have the language and you don't know anything about it, and you're even taught to fear stuff about fear your body, fear of your mind, fear your emotions, and then you have that stuff coming up, so you don't even have just like the mental resources to deal with those things, is a very common, and also just makes it super difficult on the other side. And then all of the practical things that we talked about of just having to learn to navigate the school system and get into college and get into a job, writing a resume,
Yeah.
interviewing, presenting yourself when you are in your late 20s and you don't have any work experience to put on your resume. People not understanding, like they don't understand, and so they have no idea what you're dealing with, and so they just look at you like you're weird, or like, why do you have nothing on your resume, or and like there's no awareness in the wider world of the challenges that we're trying to overcome and navigate, which then just kind of compounds this isolation that can sometimes continue, isolation and validation that can sometimes continue afterwards. And just like, I mean, I think when you and I encountered one another on Instagram, you were the only person that I found on Instagram who was like talking about this movement publicly, the first person, I guess. And this reality that like we had no idea other people existed, or we had no idea that other people existed who were unhappy and trying to get out. Like,
Yeah.
it's just painted as this like beautiful, perfect world, and you feel so isolated in even just your escape and recovery. And I don't know if you did this, but I just did a lot of pretending of just like, oh, I'm fine, I am a normal human being.
There's a
Everything is fine.
there's a lot of like nodding at jokes that I didn't get and like just like like
Didn't watch that
um
movie.
I got my first job by cobbling together a resume of it was things like played piano at church and sold things on eBay, these things that aren't real jobs, but that's all I had to put on a resume. And I eventually got an entry-level job at a bakery, and one of my coworkers asked me a little bit about my background. I try to like keep it really simple. And
Mhm.
then from then on, she just thought I had grown up Amish, which For those who don't know, is another it's like a closed community in the US, Amish or the plain community. And it's very similar. So I didn't actually correct her because I was like, well, basically, yes, I grew up very much like somebody in that community. We just had different clothing, basically.
Mm-hmm. I remember people making that, oh, Amish? Oh, you grew up
Mhm.
Amish. And I'd be like, no, 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 it wasn't. It wasn't. Amish like got defensive of like,
Mhm.
like it wasn't that bad. But it was. So
Yeah.
I know like our clothing was just different and we did make our own bread. And the only reason why we didn't have chickens was because I wrote a 12-page research paper on why we shouldn't get chickens. We were definitely heading into the homestead world.
Yeah.
And I think maybe some family members that I no longer talk to are still in that world,
Hmm.
homesteading, doing the homestead life, which there's nothing wrong with homesteading. Nothing wrong with homesteading. Just
Yeah.
the forced, this is better than everyone
Yeah.
else
As long as
posture.
it's your choice, I think that's the main thing is if you choose something that is okay, obviously, but if you're coerced into doing it because, especially because if you're a woman,
Mhm,
and that's where you're supposed to be, that's when it really becomes problematic.
mhm.
Um, so I guess we're kind of already talking about our next question, which is why is it important for people to know about this movement, Christian patriarchy? And, one of the things we already brought up is people don't understand, they've never heard of it. And then when survivors leave, they don't have a lot of resources to fall back on. They don't know how to acclimate to this new culture. It's kind of a culture shock. So if you could go back and think of yourself when you first left, what do you wish people already knew about this that would have helped you?
Hmm. I think I was so embarrassed about it that I'm curious what it would have been like to meet someone who at that time who had also gone through it. Or, and maybe it was like 5 or 6 years ahead. Um, that would have been helpful.
And we
Um,
both left, we both left about a decade ago or
yeah,
more, a little more.
yeah. And I was 26 when I moved out of my parents' home. And then I was 28 when I moved away from my hometown. So it was kind of like little pieces, slowly leaving, fully. Um, and yeah, so I think there was definitely a season where I just wanted to pretend it didn't happen and wanted to just be as normal as possible. And it was like 5 or 6 years later, maybe not quite that long. Yeah, maybe 2 or 3 years later when I first started going to therapy, um, that I was able to start understanding how bad it was and start very tentatively using the word abuse, um, and had like a therapist have to give me permission to use that word, like you're allowed to, because abuse for still present day modern day world, people think of abuse, they think of violence, like physical violence, beating people up, rape, um, starvation, torture. Like that's a lot what many people go to when they think of abuse. And most of the abuse in these communities is the subtle emotional, psychological, financial, spiritual, and many people don't have a category for that. But that type of abuse is just as damaging and sometimes more damaging
Mhm.
because we're not able to validate our own experience. And so we're not actually addressing the reality of what happened to us because we don't see it as bad as it really was. And so
Yeah.
that actually make it worse than if you had gotten punched in the face, because then you actually have something tangible that tells you it was bad. But when you had food on the table and you had clothing and you had gas in your car and you got to go on vacation with your family, like all of these outward things are gaslighting you into thinking that you actually had a good life. And so any of that trauma that we mentioned that is starting to surface you just keep doing it to yourself. You just keep suppressing it. You just keep pushing it back down. I don't know if that was where we were going with that question, but
No, I think,
came up. What do you think would have been helpful for you with what that would have been helpful for other people to know?
yeah, I think, in the general same direction of more people understanding this dynamic of spiritual abuse and how it takes time to heal from that, and that you need to be supported and not judged, or have your experience minimized.
Mhm.
Um, for me, I what I'm hoping after this conversation is more and more people get to know what's really happening, because this is still happening.
Mhm.
I don't know anyone who really uses stay-at-home daughter as a term anymore, even though that was what the term my family used. Um, they might not use that anymore. They might not even use quiverful, which is a similar term, anymore. And they might just be more subtle about their lifestyle. But I'm in contact, I think both of us have been in contact with women still stuck, and trying to talk them through steps they need to take to get out because they want to get out. And it's really difficult.
Mhm.
So to this day, there are people who are stuck in this Christian patriarchy ideology
And
movement.
the next generation is starting with
Yes.
like babies being born into this and
Yeah.
living in this, and married moms
Hmm.
and who are our age now,
Yeah.
raising their children in the same world. It very much still exists,
Right.
and might even be more powerful because it's like the next generation,
Hmm.
and so they've learned tactics.
Yeah. It's more subtle.
Yeah, and they've learned how to blend in even more
Yeah.
into the world, and it's really terrifying.
Hmm. And then the second thing I comes to mind is that Christian patriarchy as a concept, as an ideology, happens on a spectrum. So I think both of us had pretty extreme, what other people would think of as extreme experiences of being coerced. Um, this whole idea of men being in charge of women is very pervasive in the American church across many denominations.
Mhm.
So it's not just, those extreme families that it's important to understand. It's important to understand how this belief system can be pervasive in many churches, and sometimes it just uses different language, but it's still patriarchal. It's still harmful. It's just not as overt.
Mhm.
So
And it's
yeah,
still portrayed as good, like we're
right.
protecting you. You don't have to do this.
Hmm.
Why would you want to do this? You know?
Right.
Yeah, just like the way that that played out in seminary, of just like, women were allowed to get a master's of divinity, but you weren't allowed to get ordained. So it was kind of like, why would you put yourself through the pain of getting a master's of divinity if you can't do anything with it? So it was kind of like the same type of approach, and always framed as for your good,
Hmm.
and always framed as God's way. And
Hmm.
we're just listening to the Bible. Like, we didn't write the Bible. We're just doing what God says. Like it's not us saying it. This is God saying it. And we're just, maybe we even wish God would have said it differently, but this is how God said it. So we're just it's not us. It's not us. We're just trying to do it God's way. And it's the same type of mentality, just um, more socially acceptable to some extent. And then, patriarchy itself exists everywhere.
Right.
But the church is where it is specifically protected by a higher power and a sacred text. And
Hmm.
that's very dangerous, extremely dangerous,
Hmm.
and
And
extremely.
at least in the US, by tax exempt status, so there's not a lot of accountability.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Like there's no other industry where a woman isn't allowed to have a certain level. There are other ways that you bar women from having executive positions, or um, being company owners or whatever, but this is the only industry where you are allowed by law to bar someone based on their gender, based on their sexual orientation, sexual identity. and you're allowed to use God and the Bible to do it. And that's what makes it really dangerous.
And not pay taxes.
And not pay taxes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a great way to start a cult.
Mm-hmm. You said it.
So, I mean, that brings us to like the bigger picture of like, now that we've grown up, we experience this as kids. Let's briefly talk about like the influence throughout our country, throughout the US that we're seeing now today, because I think that a lot of issues that are happening can be directly tied to this whole ideology.
Yeah. And I just remember how militant it was and how we were just educated like with this mindset of taking over the world and
Mhm.
taking over the government and actively putting, religious right people into office, working for them, campaigning for them. We went to camps where we were taught about how the government worked with the intention that we would be the government leaders someday, and or the
Mhm.
men would, and we would be married to them. And then they would teach us things like apologetics and about capitalism and all of these things, and anti-abortion um, and the gay agenda and all of these things that we were indoctrinated with. And then now, like almost 2 decades later, to see what's happening in our culture right now in the just the wider United States with the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the trans rights being under attack and all of these things that are happening, to realize that this community and this world played a long game and
Mhm.
that this was their agenda. Like, this was not an accident. This world that you and I grew up in has been actively working behind the scenes to put this kind of stuff in place. So it is
Mhm.
not an irrelevant conversation to wider culture. It's actually a very relevant conversation to wider culture.
Right. Unfortunately, I never thought that I'd be able to speak to relevant, or my story would be relevant to what's happening.
Because of how
Um,
isolated we were. So.
yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, it's I don't want it to sound like a conspiracy theory, but we can trace what we were taught and how especially the young men were trained into things like the Heritage Foundation or Liberty University, these pipelines to political power that Christian patriarchal leaders would push people into, people our age. And so now we're seeing them
Yep.
get in those positions and actually make the choices based on these ideas. And we grew up very authoritarian, right? So our system is very authoritarian. And now we can see how they're imposing authoritarian principles on our government, which is undermining democracy. Someone even like the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, like he would have been fit in perfectly with our church, right? He's a very authoritarian, patriarchal type of Christian. And he's and third in line or second in line for the presidency if something happens, right? So we
Mm-hmm.
are seeing at the top levels of politics how this whole culture from the 90s is building up and influencing how the whole country is going to be living. And we saw that with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which I don't know about you, but when that happened, my whole body was in shock because it just
Ah,
reminded me of like
it's
that
what they
feeling.
wanted. And
Yeah.
those people are celebrating this
Hmm.
because they worked really hard, worked very hard, very intentionally for this. This is not an accident that this happened.
Right.
There was a lot of stuff being put in place. And so, yeah, it is not to be ignored for sure.
Yeah.
It's definitely to be we need to pay attention
Hmm.
to small, seemingly insignificant fringe groups who just have long game agenda.
Hmm.
And the whole idea of like you are having these children and you're raising them and that they're going to take over the world is a long game. It's a long game. It's a cultural culture war.
I mean, we were taught that. It sounds crazy probably to people who weren't raised that way, but that's how we were taught. Like, it's not a conspiracy. We were really, really raised to think like that.
Yes. Yes. Conspiracy is not true. This actually is.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately.
Yes, we can attest to the things that we were taught and
Mhm.
and how yeah, just how very militant and active this world is, despite also being very isolated and separated from culture,
Yeah.
is very active in influencing culture.
Mhm.
And that I think is unique to cults, because I think cults tend to isolate. And so I think this is an isolation, but an isolation with an agenda, which is really dangerous.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, because you're spreading the harm. You're not satisfied with hurting your own little group of people, but you're trying to bring more people into that cult.
Yeah. Do we want to just talk about some things for folks, both for folks who are recovering from this and then folks who are working with people and encountering people recovering from this?
Yeah.
Talk about some hope in the aftermath.
I
Well,
think
first,
both.
go ahead.
Go ahead.
I would just say that I think we are hope to some extent. It's just the fact that we have made careers, we've made lives outside of this world, we've made choices, we are okay, and in some cases, I would say we're thriving and we're moving towards thriving. So that is 100% possible. It's time. It takes time. It takes intentionality. It also takes just like a lot of patience and a lot of compassion, but it's not, there is hope for reclaiming our lives and reclaiming our stories in the aftermath. That is absolutely 100% possible.
Mhm. I was going to say the exact same thing. And on top of that, just thinking back and realizing how difficult it was to leave and how it feels like it was a miracle that
Mhm.
we got to leave. But at the same time, there was something inside us, like our inner self or intuition, that knew this was wrong and that we needed to leave to survive.
Mhm.
And so that to me is hopeful because no matter how much a cult can oppress you or keep you from living a free life, they can't destroy your spirit completely. Like even if it's a tiny little flicker,
Mhm.
you can fan it back alive. That's how I feel.
Yeah.
And um, and I think the more of us who are talking, like compared to 10 years ago, there was nobody talking about this. And now there's many more people talking about this. And I hope that helps people who are coming out of the movement or similar lifestyles find a sense of safety on this other side. Because like I said earlier, there's still people trying to figure out how to leave. And I always say, like, let's make a plan. You know, you're not going to be able to leave overnight, probably, unless there's something really dangerous happening.
Mhm.
Um, but there are resources now. There's, the organization you founded, Tears of Eden, um, and similar organizations. And there's way more resources now. I think our understanding of trauma and religious trauma specifically has improved so much that we have a lot more language to help people with. And I know you can speak to that too, because you're a trauma recovery coach.
Yeah. And it's very similar to, I think, the stay-at-home daughter escaping is very similar to a woman in an abusive marriage escaping. And a lot of the dynamics are very similar of just not having the financial resources, a lot of times having lost a lot of access to community and family and friends who are going to help you. And so making that plan. And I would just encourage like folks maybe listen to resources about women leaving domestically violent situations, because it is what we are describing is a domestically violent situation. And then I think an approach that I work with my clients and also employ myself for myself is acknowledging, because I feel like we experience so much shame, or at least I do, of why did I let them do that to me? Or like, why did I accept this? And like, why didn't I leave sooner? And all of this kind of stuff. And I think it's really helpful to have the approach when we look back on our story to acknowledge the resources that we did have, and the, as you mentioned, just like that little spark, the times that we listened to that, the times that our personality or our desire, we listened to our desires, we listened to our wants, we did make choices that were counter to the world that we were living in, and acknowledge the strength and the courage that it took to even question ever, or to even acknowledge that we weren't happy, and how much courage that takes. And that is the same courage that we have access to in the aftermath to recover and to build a new life. That doesn't disappear, and we still have that, and it gets to grow. As you said, we get to fan that flame, and that gets to grow. And I feel like people who end up escaping are they're such incredibly strong people. Like they have escaped hell, and they are just incredibly resilient human beings, that I believe can do anything. Like if you can survive that and you can get out of it, we'll have these like, oh, I have all these limitations because I don't have this work experience and I don't have this. Like, you escaped this really awful situation, you can do anything. Like, you can literally do anything you want, because you have the stamina and the resources and the mental clarity to be able to just overcome so many things because of this. And so, and I'm not using that to justify what happened or to excuse it or provide a reason for it. No, not okay. Never, ever, ever okay. But I do think that there's just an element of redemption on the other side of it, with these very, very strong, vibrant, incredible women who have defied something that is very powerful and very, very dangerous and all-encompassing. Yeah, so it's definitely possible, and it's a journey, absolutely 100% journey. And we deserve all of the compassion in the world for just everything that we have experienced. And when we do struggle, I'm coming out of a pretty intense season of depression right now, that is directly related to trauma, and just having to learn to just, it makes so much sense that this is something that I'm still navigating, and give myself that compassion and the rest that I need to give my body the resources to heal, and that itself is subterfuge for the world that told me that depression didn't exist. So.
Yeah, great. And it's like this idea that you're not strong and resilient because of what you went through, but despite what you went through and what happened to you and how people treated you. Like, that didn't create you as a strong person. You were able to escape that as a strong person. So I think that shift is helpful to get rid of that shame a little bit, because I don't know if it's hard to live with the regrets of like, why didn't I leave sooner? But we did the best we could. And I find on this other side, the whole world is open. And if I can leave something like this and change my mind, I feel like anybody can, except for maybe like psychopaths. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist, but I do think most people can change. And so that gives me hope that as a culture, people like us who talk from these marginalized spaces or experiences, we can come together and speak up about injustice and bodily autonomy, and making sure people understand what consent is. These kinds of conversations, we keep having them, and the more of us who keep talking about it, I do think that people can change and that we can make the world a safer place. away from these types of abuses. So that gives me hope. Like, I don't want to be a cynical person. It's hard because you know the dark side of human behavior, but just accepting that helps you move forward and find a new way to live. And yeah, I feel like there's a lot of agency in being able to like move forward out of that.
Absolutely. If folks want to chat with you more and know more about your story, how can they find you?
Yeah, you can go to my website, caitwest.com, CAITWEST. My book is called Rift, and it's available online, even globally, I believe. So you should be able to get it if you live outside of the US. And I have a newsletter at caitwest.substack.com.
Woohoo! And I'm Katherine Spearing, and you can find my personal Instagram is katherinespearing.com. Nope, at Katherine Spearing. Personal Instagram is my main social media source. And then the website, my website is katherinespearing.com. And then the nonprofit is called Tears of Eden, and it is for survivors of spiritual abuse. And there are plenty of folks who come from the stay-at-home daughter movement, the Christian patriarchy movement, and then most of the folks are coming from evangelical spaces of experiencing abuse in evangelical spaces. And that also has a podcast called Uncertain. And that social media presence is also Instagram at Uncertain Podcast. So come hang out and check it out.
Yeah.
Love to have you.
Thank you for listening.